Welcome to the third video on multiplayer guides for the different types of players for multiplayer. This video is devoted to the breaker class or breaker role. And the first two that I did, the defender and the healer, are pretty straightforward. You do have options for what you want to use in their card decks. However, the breaker, I think, and then later the attacker are a bit, I won't say completely flexible, but there are more options, and some of those options are even more dependent on the particular job that you have than the healer or the defender. At least that has been my experience so far, and people can correct me if that is not actually quite the case. So for the let's start with the responsibilities in multiplayer for the breaker, because I think this might have changed over time as the ability cards that Square Enix has made available to us have changed. I think the role of the breaker has probably changed a little bit with that. I could be wrong, but my impression is that early on in multiplayer, getting the yellow gauge down was sort of a collective effort between some contributions from not just the breaker but also the attacker and maybe even the defender. I don't think that's the case anymore. In my mind, the breaker's responsibility is to get both the yellow gauge and the red gauge. Now, if the attacker is helping out with that, well, that's great, no problem. But I think the primary responsibility on the yellow gauge and the red gauge to break the boss is on the breaker. And my card setups that I recommend will reflect that. Okay, so let's look at some card setups. Well, first of all, I should know, in addition to the responsibility of breaking the mob, generally most people expect the breaker to go last, except in maybe some very specific situations. For example, maybe if the breaker is going to break the boss, then go third and the attacker goes last to do damage. And part of the reason for that is the breaker is responsible for generating orbs for the group. Okay, the healer and the tank or defender, they both need orbs. The attacker is going to need orbs at certain times, so that responsibility to make sure that they can drive, resist, or get health orbs, that is on the breaker. Okay, so let's look at some card setups. Here's one configuration that I have. I've played a couple different breakers. I started out with trying it with just one of the breakers in Onion Job, the Viking Onion Job breaker, which of course isn't that effective. And then I got lucky and pulled this Grappler breaker card, which I actually like a lot. I think the Monk, without question, the Grappler right now in my mind is the best breaking job for multiplayer in the game. So the first, what do you want? Well, you want an ability that takes out the yellow gauge. And there are many of those now available in multiplayer and also in the regular game as well. They've created these monk cards now, and they all have these very, very powerful break power stats on them. You're not going to do damage, but quite frankly, it was never the breaker's job to do damage, so that's completely irrelevant. The only time that's going to annoy people is if you're trying to do, you know, some harder single player, game of or fight of some kind. So all of these Sicarus cards in multiplayer that you can get have these great break power on them. I will soon have this at level 10, almost there. So you want one of those, and really you need to get, okay, so obviously this one of course is best against Odin, the wind boss. And so ideally, I've gotten all of these, but I don't have them all leveled up. It takes a lot of time and farming to do that. So you can use this. So here's this one, right? It's still kind of low. So you can use this against more than just Odin, but of course, it's not quite as effective. This card is also very good because it's an area. It's the only one that's AoE, and so it's going to hit both the guards and the boss. And then they also have this cleaving attack on it here. This one does, which is also nice. So this is a really good one. Use this whenever possible. Some of the new monk cards that you get in the regular game, there are some AoE ones that just came out. In fact, with my last draw, my last set of summoning tickets, I was trying to get some of the limited edition cards, and instead I got, I don't know that I have it in a deck yet, but I got the dark version that's not Sicarus, the Grizzly I think it's called, which is an AoE. So there are some now in regular game that are AoE that have different element affinities. So those are really good cards. You want to get those if you're a breaker. So next to the yellow gauge, to help get the red gauge, you want in the group, either on yourself or the attacker, to have an ability that lowers the defense against break. This is again why you want to have multiple configurations set up and ready to go, so that if your group already has some of these, maybe you want to go with a different setup and not carry it. But generally, I do think this is the one debuff that maybe is the responsibility of the breaker to carry. Then, of course, my Knight of the Round. The other option for players who have been around a while, they're going to have a different card. What you need is boost. So there's another card that a bit cheaper than this one. Still hard to level, but a bit cheaper. Only costs 2 heart orbs as well, and you can use that one for boost. So you want that boost to break power. I prefer this card though. I don't often carry haste. It is completely expected for the support healer to have haste, but I do like to carry the supercharger. And I didn't point this out on the healing tutorial, which I probably should have, but the supercharger was really nice because it comes with this +1 life starter, and so that helps. Sometimes I start right out with 3 heart orbs, and so I can use my Knights of the Round right away. So that's your basic card setup. You need something to get the yellow gauge, you need something to help debuff to break the red gauge, you need a buff to increase your attack power and your boost, your break power, and then something for your actions. That is, in my mind, the ideal setup for the breaker. Now, the one thing I should point out is these monk cards come with the imbue weapon ability. Back in the day, you're going to see people who have breakers that don't have these kinds of cards, right, that aren't monks. They might carry the poo-poo cards in order to cast those. So the good thing about these Sicarus cards and also the new monk cards is that they all come with this imbue, so you don't need poo-poo anymore. So that's kind of bittersweet, if you have a non-monk breaker, if you don't have the grappler, then what you might end up doing is, instead of carrying the extra actions or instead of carrying the break defense, you might want the poo-poo card instead. Or maybe you depend on the healer to have Knights of the Round, and you have to depend on them for that. So basically, these monk cards allow you to reduce the number of cards that you have. Okay, so that's basically the type of setup that you want, and of course, ideally you will vary the elemental affinity of these cards based on the boss that you're fighting to be as efficient as possible. The one boss that you might carry 2 monk cards, 2 of these on, that get the yellow gauge, I don't know that it's really necessary, but the only boss that you have to think about that is probably is it Anima, that has both light and dark for the guards. And so if you have the light card it won't work very good against the dark card. So that's something to keep in mind. So you do need to adjust some of these decks based on the particular boss that you're fighting. When it comes to fractals, to modify these cards, okay, again, this is another one that I really need to replace because the light resistance doesn't do much for me. I've left it because it was a +5. So eventually that'll be removed. Attack up +5% I think is fine. But then what I really want is break power up as well. So those are the fractals, break power and attack power +5. And it just takes a lot of grinding to get those on the cards that you want. I will have more than one KTO card in my card pool because obviously, just dumb luck. I got this +10% experience, but honestly, I'd like a Knights of the Round card, particularly set up for my breaker at some point. But that is probably down the road. Okay. Custom skills. Again, the most important stats are the attack power and break power, and so that's exactly what I'm focusing on my breaker. I do have a couple hit point things there. Eventually, I'll probably move those to a different character. If I decide to play an attacker, attackers tend to be the squishiest of the jobs in the game, and so I think that might be where the hit points, one of the places where they might be most useful. Everything else is going to be attack, power, break power. All right, that's going to be the focus. For weapon selection, I'm really torn. I don't have many options for monk weapons, and I am really torn by the one that I chose to upgrade. I decided to upgrade the Eisenfaust X for better or worse, partly because it's got the +3 third strike. It used to be the orbs weren't that important for a breaker, but now with these good monk cards, I think you do have to use your orbs, but you also have to have your actions because you want to be hitting your 3 physical attacks every turn if possible to generate orbs for your other group members. And so that's kind of useful there. And then the other thing that's somewhat useful now that the ability cards are more important for the breaker, particularly this monk breaker, the Prismatic Draw comes in handy. It allows me to get some extra heart orbs or other orbs that you might need. This one looks actually like one of the better ones for breaking because it has this painful break +50%, which is great. And what turned me off by it was this extended break, which is completely useful for multiplayer. And so I don't know, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should have used this one anyway rather than go with this choice. But for better or worse, that's what I have at the moment. I haven't had any problem breaking. The goal of this grappler, or with any breaker, especially with this grappler, is if I have the right orbs when the fight begins, I can break both the guards on the first turn. And I can break the boss on the second turn. So by the end of the second turn, everything's been broke once. That's sort of my goal, and that is very feasible. Now, sometimes if you have a really bad orbs, luck with the orbs at the beat, for the first round, you might not be able to get up to that. But that is at the latest, by the third round, at the absolute latest, both guards should have been broke, and the boss should have been broke the first time. I should say one more note on other card options. If you don't have a monk in addition to the poo-poo option, the other option for, let me go to, the other option is the Echo. If you happen to be around with the Echo card, this has the Cleaving Strike ability. Okay. Now you got to be careful of this because it does do Berserk, so it does a lot more damage, but it also, lowers your defense, so you can die. So be careful of that. But it has the cleaving attack, so you hit all enemies. So basically, you can kind of use this with poo-poo, and kind of try to get the same effects as these monk cards have. It's just, you really have to make some serious decisions about what your priorities are for your deck if you don't have a monk, but you want to try to do some of those other types of abilities. So that is about it for the breaker. So that is it. Get the red gauge, get the yellow gauge, get the red gauge, generate orbs for your group. So those attackers can do the damage, right, to finish off those bosses real quick. And I guess that's it for the breaker. I can't think of anything else, so peace out till next time.